Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our roundtable of regularly scheduled panelists. First, we have Dr. Lawrence Brown, who's the senior pastor of the Queensboro Seventh-day Adventist Church in New York City. Next, we have Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have also with us Mr. Andre Wong, who is the General Counsel of the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we also have with us Mr. Vilo Weiss, who's from the Indiana Conference, who's Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for that department. Great to have you guys with us and looking forward to our show today. You know, there's been a lot of congressional information that's been moving around, and one of the things that's led to is congressional funding that many have called a mixed bag as it relates to issues on abortion and also issues as it relates to religious freedom. You know, this latest spending package allows federally funded gender transitions and essentially bypasses current restrictions on government-funded abortions. It appears that the baseline pro-life provisions were retained in a second minibus, but that was passed last time. However, other provisions, such as those prohibiting the use of taxpayer dollars from funding abortion, issues as it relates to gender transitions, they were excluded as part of a result of an appropriations negotiation. Protections from preborn life, religious liberty, biblical gender. There were a lot of different decisions that went back and forth. So in this $1.2 trillion bipartisan bill, many will call it just a mixed bag. You know, Melissa, you spent a lot of time down on Capitol Hill, obviously looking to protect religious freedom and issues that impact individuals and their concerns as it relates to where they go to church, how they serve their God, and what they believe in from a quote unquote labor standpoint, and sometimes even a health perspective. But with this quote unquote mixed bag, what should we be looking for, and what could be some big issues that we should be concerned with?
Sure. Well, you know, in taking a look at the final spending package that was passed, as you mentioned, it did include what we refer to as the longstanding Hyde family of riders, which deals with abortion. So, you know, the Hyde Amendment prevents Medicaid from covering abortion costs. The Weldon Amendment protects the rights of healthcare professionals. The Helms Amendment prevents foreign aid that directly pays for an abortion. The Smith Amendment bans funding for elective abortion through the federal employee health benefits. And then finally, the Dornan Amendment prohibits federally and congressionally approved local funds from paying for elective abortions in the District of Columbia. So that group of amendments were all included in the final version. What wasn't included is what, as you said, you know, we had a couple of House versions of the legislation that went beyond that. One of them, for example, wanted to prohibit the use of government funding for abortion procedures, for abortion-related travel. That didn't go through. And another thing, you mentioned the transgender. So there were, again, many House bills, versions or riders that basically would have enacted some of those Hyde-style protections that would prohibit the use of government funding for transgender surgeries. And that was not included. Another thing that didn't pass as far as the abortion was the Republicans were not able to block a rule that expanded access to mifepristone or the abortion pill. So, like you said, I think I would describe that as a mixed bag. It certainly wouldn't have passed if if those Hyde Amendment or that group of had not been included, and it certainly was.
Well, I thought it was interesting that certain federal employees could qualify for travel and have time off. So I wondered what the basis of that qualification was. It didn't seem to be even across the board on the federal level. And then, you know, we've got a little bit of conflict on the gender affirming care between two different groups of pediatricians. You have the American College of Pediatricians that sees no long-term benefit in that. And then you got the American Academy of Pediatrics that reaffirmed their 2018 statement, and the AMA, as well. So it is a very interesting bill.
Andre, what seems kind of interesting to me, I was actually looking at a part of the legislation, and ironically, I don't know if this is just an issue of how old I am, but I actually worked on one of these amendments with Congressman Siljander when I was actually a student in the 4th District of Michigan. This 1981 amendment, Siljander was very proud of it. And ironically, we're seeing many, many years later, I hate to say it out loud, but 40 plus years later, some of these things are still actually being attached and connected, which kind of gives the impression that there's been a lot of work that's been happening for a very long time on these areas, but we still, even after 40 years, find ourselves going up and down and finding mixed bags.
Yeah, part of legislating is not reinventing the wheel, and so why do that when there already have been good ideas and good legislation in the past? But I'd like to step back and look at this from a 30,000 foot level, and let me speak in favor and in defense of lobbying. Lobbying gets a really bad rap. We think of dirty politics and smoke-filled back rooms, but the beautiful part of our republic is the ability to lobby and advocate and persuade our elected officials to our viewpoint. And so all of us have our rights of conscience and our moral positions. And so regardless of whether it is a viewpoint that is aligns with our point of view or is completely antithetical to our point of view, the beauty of the fact that this organization or our organization can lobby our elected officials at the federal level or at the state legislature is it's a great thing. And I would even go so far to say that all legislation, all budgets are a mixed bag. You're going to have things that you love, and you're going to have things that you detest. And if I were to look at the federal budget and find things that are morally offensive to me, my life would just not be a happy place.
I was just going to say, you were talking about seeing legislation included or amendment language included that you participated in drafting it back when you were in college. And again, I've said on the show, or we've discussed on the show before, and I think this perfectly illustrates it. It's so important that when a new issue arises, as it did when you were working in the congressman's office, that you are at the table again, that you and that you participate, because the language that is used in this new situation will be what is used over and over and over again. And so that's something that we really make sure of is, we may think, oh, well, this particular religious freedom, this bill, it doesn't really affect religious freedom in a way. But if there is a component, we should absolutely be involved, because the language that's used there we will see over and over and over again.
Lawrence, when we're talking a lot, we talk about the fact that we always see these extreme politics, way over on the left, way over on the right. It seems that this particular funding package actually looks a little bit more like what you would expect, where half the people are upset, half of the people are, okay, which means that it sounds like they may have used, and excuse my use of this word, compromise may have actually taken place here. Can you imagine that?
You can only hope. But, here's what I find so hilarious about the whole thing. People want to debate and argue about these different issues, and that's what's supposed to happen. But here's what's so hilarious. People make a lot of noise and get very passionate about some of these things. But what I'm discovering, and it's not a one-off situation, what I'm discovering over and over again, people who are arguing against some of these things are against the theoretical situation. But the moment it comes home to them, the moment their daughter gets in the situation, the moment their wife gets in the situation, frequently what happens, even though they're still giving lip service to the party line, what's happening is behind the scenes, they are taking advantage of different things to remove their quote unquote problem. We saw it when a certain person was running for office, and when you dug into his history, he had made more than one trip taking an unfortunate girlfriend to have a quote unquote problem terminated. And so for me, I look at all these discussions that are going on, but what bothers me is that when real life begins playing out, all of a sudden, a different reality kicks in. And these are people typically that have the resources to swim upstream. There are a lot of folks that don't have those resources. So when real life happens for them, they're stuck with all the theoretical stuff that people came out with just because it sounds good, or just because it garners votes, or just because it'll get them a soundbite on whatever their favorite network is. Real life ought to be addressed by legislation that takes these different things into account. And frequently, that's not the case. And that's what I find so unfortunate about where we are right now.
Vilo, what's kind of interesting is when you see these pieces of legislation, people assume that they know, well, who exactly was that for? But in a state like where you may be in Indiana, there would be some people who would assume that this may be a state that leans more conservative. But even over the last few days, we've been talking about issues where there's court rulings that come down that look fairly liberal. There are other issues that come down the pike that look a little bit more conservative. It's literally, we're at a point where you don't even know if you can know for sure what a quote unquote red state is going to do because of the small pockets that exist, even in the midst of different kinds of federalism or being quote unquote more conservative or more liberal. That seems to make the whole process even more confusing, and people don't even know who to root for at this point.
That's right. It can vary from issue to issue. Who's going to stand up for it and shout for it? Who's going to oppose it? It's an amazing time to be alive. And what troubles me is that our political system has gotten so beholden to the extremes of their respective parties. They can't get together in the middle and get something done for the good of the country. That really worries me.
Well, Andre, if we're going to be looking for the good of the country, it just seems to me that we might have to find a whole new set of legislators to work with.
Yeah, you hear that at every level. They're even talking about doing that even at the local level in my district for the water district.
In defense of our legislators, and this is, some of them or whatever, it's a thankless job, absolutely. And so I appreciate those who go into it well-intentioned, with good intentions, wanting to serve in a way, because as I said, it's like being a local church pastor. It's a thankless job.
Well, I'm going to let that be the last word, Melissa, but I think we have at least a situation here where it looked like people were working hard to try to come down the middle. We don't see this happen often all the time, but I think you already know that when you've done something, if half the people love it and half the people hated it, you probably did a good job. The court case Gaddy versus Corporation of the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is an interesting case where you have 3 former members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that are suing the church in federal court and accusing it of basically propounding false beliefs and misrepresenting its religious history and practices to defraud members of donations. There have been a number of individuals who have filed lawsuits and friend of the court briefs. This has found its way all the way up to the 10th Circuit. I think probably there was a time in our lives where we would have said, listen, no one would end up suing regarding issues of doctrine or governance or where the quote unquote tithe money or any of the donations that come in. But Gaddy is accusing the church of misrepresenting its history and its beliefs and basically creating a ploy to increase memberships, in which she says has resulted in basically more tithes. In other words, she's almost suing that her church is like a Ponzi scheme. We try to figure out how do we get more in at the bottom, and only the people benefiting are at the top. And as a result, she'd like to see this done away with, and has gone into federal court and actually seems to be getting some traction with that. Andre, I don't know where we're going to be if all of a sudden members start winning cases over what you can do with your tithe money and whether or not your doctrines, quote unquote, are something that's a ploy to get more memberships. You know, we almost describe evangelism there. I don't know how we deal with this, but what are your thoughts on this case that is actually moving up the federal dockets?
It is interesting, and the background actually is pretty interesting because Laura Gaddy, who was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was just looking at the church website and found information that she said was inconsistent with traditional church teachings and the history of the church. And as she then examined balance sheets and giving statements, she felt that it was a misrepresentation of that history and beliefs to increase membership. And so in her suit, she says that this was not just an innocent misstatement, but actually a deliberate and calculated attempt to increase the membership and therefore tithe dollars. And so yeah, the federal district court in Utah dismissed her case straight away because it's settled legal doctrine that churches stay out of matters of ecclesiastical teachings and business. And Laura Gaddy, together with two other members, appeal decision. It's now at the 10th Circuit. I think that I think we're gonna see them stick to the notion that courts need to stay out. But this is an interesting situation because when an organization, whether religious or not, financially benefits through false statements and false pretenses, calculated and intentional, shouldn't there be some sort of civil recourse and restitution for those that gave their money based on those pretenses? It'll be an interesting.
Yeah, well, you see, here's what makes me a little nervous about things like this, though. I have been a pastor for many years, and I've also been a departmental director for many years. And I said all that because when you are dealing with large groups of people, you can use a word, and that word will be taken and digested and interpreted 1,000 different ways in the same room. And so to think that somebody who is taking issue with a particular teaching is now going to attack the foundations or attack the structures of that organization, that's a problem. First of all, she's assuming that her take on a thing is the take, is the orthodox, is the bona fide, is the dyed-in-the-wool way to see a thing. And that's a dangerous assumption to make. She could be the one that's wrong. She could be the one that completely misread, completely misunderstood. And I'm telling you, as a pastor, and not just a pastor, I am a very good communicator. I am very intentional in trying to engage with people a certain way so that we don't have misunderstandings. And guess what? We still end up having misunderstandings. So the point is, you can work as hard as you want to clarify message and to make sure it's going across a certain way. Somebody, based on how they were raised, based on how they see things, based on their special connection with God, somebody is going to be at odds with how a thing is taught. And you just have to accept that that's how it is and hope that eventually over time you can pray your way through, work your way through. But to think that every time somebody gets upset with something that happens in church, now we're rushing off to court, that's problematic. That's problematic. And if you're going to return tithe, and history is full of famous titans of industry who got that way because of their commitment to tithe. If you're going to return tithe, understand that you are doing it because it is what God has asked us to do. It has nothing to do with whether or not I think something's being done the way I think it ought to be done. When I have to stand before God, if he asked me why I was not faithful in doing what he asked me to do, it's going to ring mighty hollow when I start rattling off all the things that I thought, weren't being done right. And so for that reason, no, it doesn't work that way. We do what we're supposed to do because God asked us to do it. And everybody else will have to answer to God for what they do or don't do. But at the end of the day, I need to have faithful registered next to my name.
It's interesting that people from various segments of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or any church for that matter, are going to have different views on doctrine, and I think it's very dangerous to want the courts to decide this. Thankfully, the courts have recognized that this is a non-justiciable issue. It's something that the court should stay out of because of the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. This is not the same thing as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints hiding $32 billion in an investment fund. That was a violation of law, not a violation of beliefs. And so I think this case is going to be dead. Is not going to make any more progress beyond the 10th Circuit. They're going to reject it, thankfully, I hope.
Yeah, I think the practicality of, were we to change directions legally and suddenly open the doors to former members or current members of religious denominations taking their, that would now, the church, whatever church, whether it's the LDS Church, the Adventist Church, the Catholic Church, it would become a full-time job defending these sorts of lawsuits. Besides the fact, as Viala was just saying, it's completely inappropriate because of the separation of church and state, and rightly so, right? This is a realm where the government should not be engaged in any way. It is interesting, though, Orlin, as you said, that a few years back it was just sort of settled of, okay, I found out something, or my interpretation now, I'm not happy with my religious organization. What was you just left the church, right? There wasn't even a thought about potentially taking them to court. But now we are living in such a litigious society that that's where we're at as far as, so, I think unfortunately we'll probably see more and more of these sort of cases.
But Andre, this is my struggle, and I appreciate hearing from Pastor Brown. And to be honest, I almost wanted to come up and join the church after he got done. However, when you start thinking about the fact that you have these religious organizations running multi-billion-dollar operations in which they are making statements to individuals to take those funds in. But if you're a pastor who calls yourself a pastor and you get a whole bunch of individuals to give you money in a way that somebody else may deem to be illegal, or even something that caused them to be, I guess, confused or untowards in any way, we call that being involved in a fraudulent transactions. Mm-hmm. How do I draw the line between a person who calls himself a pastor, brings in money, quote unquote, the law comes back and says that's fraudulent, or just because I am, quote unquote, a better, more established religious institution, I kind of get a pass, or you give me the benefit of the doubt? I'm not sure I can see how you draw the line that easily, because the courts will be involved if we view it as being a fraudulent transaction, even though somebody may call themselves a pastor and call what they have going on in church.
Right, and I think that's the basis of this case, because what Ms. Gaddis is alleging is not that she just has a disagreement with the doctrines and beliefs of the Mormon Church, but what she's saying is they perpetrated a fraud. They're perpetrating a fraud on the members and the public in order to gain financial advantage. And so, by the way, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said here. The courts do need to stay out of church and ecclesiastical matters. But you're exactly right. I mean, at what point do we say, okay, when the church is acting with deliberate intent to get financial advantage, then then when can we step in? When can the court step in and intervene on that basis? But actually, I agree with Pastor Brown. I think of the story of the widow who gave her last mite. When she put that mite into the offering plate, she was giving to a corrupt organization, but she still gave.
Right.
And
her
at the end,
responsibility and her was it ended when she put it in the plate there, right? Like from there on out, whatever the organization, corrupt or not, it is now their responsibility. And as you said, it's on their moral responsibility as far as what they do. What happens from there.
and
It's an act
anybody,
of faith towards God rather than engaging. At least my understanding of tithing specifically, it's a relational thing with God rather than interacting. It goes well beyond interacting with your faith denomination.
good, but we
Earned that gift, and it's encouraged many in the years since that time.
Well, I'm going to tell you that I completely agree with a lot of what you have said, but I can also tell you, as somebody who used to work as a regulator for the Security and Exchange Commission, we actually did go and have a lot of conversations with individuals who were pastors, who quote unquote were engaged in activities that they called churches. Some we've even seen on TV on a regular basis, and I won't call their names, but we ended up having some really deep conversations, and I can tell you without hesitation, it wasn't that far away from being fraud, even though we called it being about Jesus. Andre, tell me something I don't know.
So on their trek out west, Mormon pioneers were directed not or to maintain a positive attitude. But Brigham Young, sensing their discontent, appointed, I'm not joking, a chief grumbler whose only job was to had the legal authority to complain without violating the law.
Have mercy. Vilo, tell me something I don't know.
The Mormons were traveling westward, and I'm running down the same path you were, Andre. They came to a vote because they needed to travel 6 days rather than 5, and Sabbath barely lost, and Sunday became the day of worship.
Unbelievable. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
All right, so I'm going to go back to our federal budget and the appropriation bill that we were discussing at the top of the hour. Did you know, or it included more than 6,600 individual projects?
Wow. Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
everyone is anti-abortion until the wife finds out that her husband's girlfriend is pregnant.
That's a good one there. Listen, it was great talking to you guys and looking forward to doing this again. Thanks again for being with us today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.